see everyone. Delighted that you're here. Brother Steve's looking for our stand. If we don't find it, we'll improvise without it. We have attempted the last couple of weeks to look at our ethical and moral challenges that we face in life from a practical standpoint of how do we prepare ourselves to be that person, those persons who make really good decisions. Where do we start? And we really don't start when we get in those dilemmas. We start by developing our character and our disposition to be like God would have us to be. And so we spent some time looking at those things the last couple of weeks, and I think we had completed last week at least our look at love, joy, and peace in our relationship to God. Thank you, sir. That fruit of the Spirit that Paul spoke to the Galatian Christians about, in direct contrast to those things of the flesh that would keep us from inheriting the kingdom of God, we are to embody that fruit of the Spirit. And sometimes we rehearse those particular things, and maybe we even do a word study from time to time on what each of those might mean. But I don't know that we always make full application of that stark contrast between missing heaven by being guilty of those sins that are listed without really understanding that it's describing to us how we can be immune, inoculated against those sins. It doesn't mean we won't face them. It doesn't mean we won't be tempted by them. But if we become the kind of person that embodies the fruit of the Spirit, then obviously we can face those challenges. Let me get my notes in order. When I was growing up in the church, we had some really good leaders, elders, and one of them in particular, he and his wife spent a lot of time with we call them young professionals now. I don't know how professional we were, but we were young couples. And so they spent a lot of time with us. And they had jobs like everybody else, and they had elder responsibilities like everybody else. And they just seemed to have devoted a lot of time to us. And my wife asked, we called him Bo. His name was Robert. We called him Bo. She said, "Brother Bo, don't you get tired?" And he said, oh yeah, I get tired. But it's a good tired. And today I'm tired, but it is a good tired. You have a job, you can provide for your family, and you get to meet with your spiritual family on Wednesday evening. And there is a difference, isn't there, in being tired because you're worn out doing things that accomplish zero or maybe even cause harm, and the time when you're absolutely fatigued, but you know why you're fatigued. And the effort you put forth accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. It helped and assisted someone else or provided for your family. And those are things that you and I need to make a contrast in. When we're dealing with the matters of life, we can get fatigued with that. We can get overwhelmed by that. But if we're striving to embody that fruit of the Spirit, if we're striving to be those kind of people, it'll be a good tired. As long as we're here, we're going to face things, and we're going to have to put forth energy and effort. And this relationship that we have with God should be filled with this love, joy, and peace. And we talked about that last week from the standpoint of even the announcement of Jesus' birth involved both peace and joy. That there was going to be glad tidings of great joy. That's why he came. That's what he wanted us to experience. That's what he wanted us to embody. And then the announcement of the birth was peace on earth, goodwill toward man. So that was God's effort, God's gift to us to make sure that we were reconciled with him and we could have the proper relationship with him. That's his part, and he did his part for those reasons. Now if we embody love, joy, and peace, That means we have been recipients of that gift, and we appreciate what He's done for us, and we try to live in such a way that it demonstrates to Him that we do appreciate His love and we love Him in return. Probably nothing turns us off more, or at least I can't think of anything that turns me off more than to see a child disrespectful to their parents. Particularly if you know that family and you know those parents are really worked hard to provide for their children, and they've sacrificed and they've done everything they know to do, and they've gone the second and third mile, and a child is disrespectful. Well, when it comes to the spiritual world, we're God's children. And He's done everything He could possibly do to make sure that we're reconciled to Him. If we don't embody this fruit of the Spirit, then we, in essence, have kind of spurned what He's provided for us. And we become somewhat spiritual ingrates, and it'll harm us when we begin to face the trials of life and trying to make moral and ethical decisions. When you embody love, then you dispel, destroy, do away with hate and wrath, and we talked about that briefly last week. Before we leave that and go and talk more detailed about our relationship with our fellow man, I want you to, I think we mentioned this last week, but I don't remember how detailed we got. But there's a passage found in Philippians chapter 4 that includes both joy and peace. And it connects it to our relationship to God and our not only His love for us, but our love for Him. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 4, it says, "Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice." Now, can we rejoice always? You see, that helps us when we're making ethical and moral decisions, if we're able to rejoice in every circumstance of life. It's when we can't rejoice and we don't know how to rejoice that we begin to improvise. We begin to try to make decisions that we think might bring us joy, or we think might remove us from embarrassment, or we begin to try to process it from a whole different vantage point. But in this context, it says we are to rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. Then he says, "Let your moderation be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. Be careful for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known unto God." Thanksgiving for what? What do we have thanksgiving for? Exactly, for everything. Everything that we are, everything we have, everything we hope for is meaningless, empty. No promise to it without God. And so if we're making our request known unto Him, it needs to come from a heart that rejoices. That you have that avenue of prayer, that you have that kind and merciful Father, that you can place those concerns and those desires before, and that those concerns and those desires would be expressed in a way that would be in harmony with His will. And that's what it's emphasizing here. So it encompasses this relationship that we have with God, and it encompasses love, joy, and peace. Now look at verse 7. If that's our attitude, we have joy, and that we go to God out of our love and respect for Him, and we give thanks for what He's done for us. Then it says, "The peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and your minds through Christ Jesus." There we are. We're able to have an understanding that we have peace with God. We understand how we receive peace from God because it's through Christ Jesus. And it takes us back to why He said, "Rejoice in the Lord always." And again I say rejoice. Most of the ethical and moral dilemmas that we get in is because we've left this part out. We're facing something that affects an immediate circumstance, and we disconnect ourselves from our relationship with God. And with that, then we begin to let the world improvise and dictate the terms of what's right or wrong, what's acceptable or unacceptable. But if this is who we are, and this is the relationship we have with God, then we know that we demonstrate in that particular relationship love, joy, and peace. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24 reminds us that we can't serve two masters. We'll love the one and hate the other, and we'll despise the one and cleave the other. Can't serve God and mammon, and so we have to get that part right. And if we hold on to that, then obviously it makes it easier for us to make really, really good decisions. We don't always start with who we are. We often start with what should we do. But if who we are is correct in our relationship with God, then we're going to make good decisions. If we're not sure who we are and we don't work on those relationships, then obviously it becomes a problem. I know some of you are listening because I've had this past week, 2 or 3 of you mentioned particular contexts of life, and you reminded each other that you need to be long-suffering. Because we talked about being patient with each other, and that's the long-suffering. We depend upon that in our relationship with God, and according to 2 Peter chapter 3, he reminds us that there is a long-suffering God who waited in the days of Noah. And there is a long-suffering God who gives us time to repent. And we depend upon that. If we didn't have a God who was patient with us, who didn't give us time to grow and mature and to repent, then the invitation that we had tonight about if we have need to be obedient to Him, we offer that invitation every time. Why? Because we have this occasion. Now, if a person had put that off and tonight was the first time they heard an invitation, it'd be because of the long-suffering of God that they had another invitation. If we needed prayers to be prayed in our behalf and forgiveness of God, what afforded that for us? Well, the long-suffering of God. Now, if that's the case, what should be our disposition in our relationship to each other? I don't know about you, but there are times when I've made excuses for impatience. And sometimes you will project on someone else and say, well, they made me mad. No, I chose to be mad. Now, their attitude and their disposition, their actions may have been inappropriate. But I got to choose how I reacted to that. And if I pause on those occasions and say, how merciful has God been with me and how patient has God been with me, and I practice with my fellow man these things, and this context of Galatians chapter 5 tells us that those characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit affect everything about not only our relationship to God, but with each other. And this long-suffering is something that we want to develop and maintain and be patient with each other. Have you ever had someone be impatient with you? Have you? How did you feel? Frustrated. That's a good way to put it. Probably the most impactful experience I had in that relationship was my youngest son had ADHD. And, some people say they have it, but he had it. With that, came a lot of, I'm a very strict disciplinarian, and he understood the rules, knew the rules, but the context was just always an upheaval. So Denise and I went to some seminars, some training, and said, all right, got to get this kid through school. We've got to get him raised. We need to do that without killing him. We need some help here. And so we went to this one particular seminar, and the doctor who was presenting the seminar was a PhD, and he was ADHD to the core. I mean, we were on his cycle, and we went from this thing to this thing, and everything was good, but we never did stay on anything very long, and then we were back over here, and the whole time he was, and I thought, how did he get a PhD? How did he navigate through all those things? And once I calmed down and realized, okay, this is a guy I really need to listen to. because he's learned how to manage it. And when he began to share things with us, one of the exercises we did that I think illustrates that clicking in my mind about being patient and long-suffering. And we had to do an exercise. And I hate going to these seminars and they pair you off, and I think, oh, brother, I don't want to do that. But, we had to pair off. You couldn't be with your spouse. And so I was with this other lady, and of course all of us there, we have children we're dealing with, and so we want to share all these sob stories. He wouldn't let us share any sob stories. We just had to do the exercise, and so we doing this exercise. He said, you start out and you take turns and you rehearse Mary Had a Little Lamb. He helped us out. He gave us Mary Had a Little Lamb, and so most of it could do it by heart, but he let us read it. And so we recited that to each other, and then he said, now, I want you to say Mary Had a Little Lamb backward, and the person who's not saying it at the time, tell the other person they need to hurry up. You know that. You just quoted Mary Had a Little Lamb to me. You just rehearsed that with me. Come on, say it to me backward. I know I'm in class. I know this is a seminar. I know I'm not going to die if this happened, but I broke out in sweat. Sweat was just running from my forehead, and my face was blushing. I was beside myself. I couldn't think of one word of Mary Had a Little Lamb. Not one. I couldn't. And I was embarrassed. I thought, well, I've failed the experience. Wow, I'm going to have to stand up. And she said, he didn't even know Mary Had a Little Lamb. Once you took the paper away from him and you told him to say it backward, he couldn't do it. And after all of us had had that experience, he said, now, that's how your child feels every day. Everybody around them is, they work in cycles and they know how to do things, and their mind thinks backward from that. And so when everybody else says, hurry up, it's time to turn in that test, they block everything out. They may have just rehearsed all those things orally in the review, and now they know nothing. Well, but I'm a good dad. I've worked real hard. If you just sit down there and memorize those things and get those done, and it changed how we approached him. We still required the same things of him, but we started giving him one thing at a time to do. Once he accomplished that, then we gave him something else to do. Then we didn't stay on his case about getting it done. If we sent him to his room to do something, if we'd check on it after a while, if they were having a problem there, we broke that down. And for once in my life, every time I'd get impatient, I'd think about Mary Had a Little Lamb. And I thought, he said, when you start saying, hurry up, you didn't do that. I told you that 20 times. You know that like the back of your hand. He blocks it all out. And I could no longer say, oh, that's not true. I blocked it all out. Because somebody told me to do something that I wasn't comfortable doing backward. And he said their minds are thinking backward. And so when you put that pressure on them, they can't do it. So when we look at folks in life, it doesn't mean we make excuses for their sin. It doesn't mean that we ignore their sin and we don't hold them accountable for their sins and we don't call them to repentance. But it does mean when we're working on our relationship with our fellow man, we remember that sometimes in circumstances of life, there needs to be patience. That we might want to put ourselves in those situations and say, what if? What if that were me? Would I want people to give up on me? Would I want them never to reach out to me again? Would I want them to write me off as useless? And he mentions those list of things that are qualities of the fruit of the Spirit. And so long-suffering, gentleness, goodness. And our relationship is with us ourselves. We have to have faith, meekness, and temperance. And then we won't spend this time on this particular slide because we did that last week. I got to reminiscing there and got behind. All right. So when you think about these things that can keep us out of heaven. If we want to make sure those things are not true in our lives, then we have to develop this fruit of the Spirit. We have to make sure that's what we live by and that permeates from us, and that'll destroy variance and emulation and sedition, those things that would divide us from each other and our relationship. And don't get me wrong on these matters. We're not talking about not trying to help folks with those matters, but that we're patient in how you do that. You might remember some experiences either with your parents or with your boss where you were expected to do something quickly and you didn't have the remediation that you needed to accomplish that. Well, those things are true also of us. And we can't leave off the other qualities that we have in our relationship with God, the love, joy, and peace. In John chapter 13 and verse 35, it said, "A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another. As I have loved you, even so love you one another." Now, is that love long-suffering? Is it patient? Well, it is, and that's what our relationship with each other ought to be. And then he said, gentleness. Denise is a gentle person in our family. And when it came to child rearing, it came to handling matters, I wasn't always gentle. And maybe we could just pause and say, what would gentle mean to you?
ESV is kindness.
All right. Steve said the ESV says kindness. What would kindness mean to you?
A sense of meekness, strength, and control.
All right. We'll talk about that a little later. Tish said meekness, which is strength under control. If a person's going to be gentle, in the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord said that we ought to get the beam out of our own eye before we got the speck out of our brother's eye. You ever had a speck in your eye? My mother and Denise are very gentle people, and if you got something in your eye, they prepare you for it, and I'm not going to poke you in the eye. Just be still, quit blinking, and they're real kind. The contrast of that would be, I've got some old work gloves that I dig around in the dirt and I do all sorts of things with. If I came up with those work gloves and you had a speck in your eye, would you consider that to be gentle? If I said, let me see what's in there, would you? There's this rough, contaminated, there's nothing about that would seem kind, is there? You'd want me to take that glove off. You'd want me to wash my hands. You'd want me to be patient. You'd want me to show. And what you didn't mention with me, kindness is a tenderness. Most mothers have that disposition, don't they? That tenderness. Their voice softens. Their touch is gentle. It's kind. It's reassuring. And Dad just like, turn around and let me see. Jerk the head around and start pulling the eyeball open. It's like, and my brother-in-law was this old rough mechanic, and he had very little patience about those things. And when I'd have something happen to me, he'd say, boy, I've had worse than that on my eyeball. If I cut my hand open and had stitches on it, he'd always say, I've had worse than that in my eyeball. And he was mean enough that you would think that probably was true of him. But he's not the kind of person that he was a kind-hearted person when he just came down to it, but his exterior wasn't something that brought you great comfort. He's not someone I'd say, can you come and get this speck out of my eye? He wasn't gentle about that. He wasn't tender about that. And so when you think about dealing with our fellow man, that will immediately dispel wrath, where you get impatient. Where you do things abruptly, where you do things without kindness. You're going to think Denise and I have been in long, extended therapy when I tell you all these workshops we've gone to, but another one of those workshops we went to with for marriage, a marriage seminar. We were being instructed on how to settle differences that might strain, might be elevated. And the person directing it would make us hold hands with each other while we're talking. You know, we had to select something that we differed on, and we were going to have to talk about it. And we're going to have to try to work through it. And he said, now, all of you kind of lowered your voices when you took each other's hand. And you spoke calmly to each other. You're sitting there really close. And he said, you know, when you feel another person's pulse, there's something about that reminds you that they're human and they have feelings. If you're sitting across a room, you can kind of throw darts at each other, you know. You can kind of say words that Brother Steve mentioned in his devotional about the woman saying he's verbally abusive. What do you mean abusive? He hurt her with his words. How do you do that? Are you kind when you do that? Are you gentle when you do that? And so he made us make sure that we could feel each other's pulse and that we could be connected to each other. And so if we spoke, we wanted to be gentle in how we spoke. And he said, you know, don't raise your voices to each other across the room. Get close enough and connected enough that you can speak to each other respectfully and kindly. Those are the kind of things that I think if we develop in our relationship with each other, we can speak the truth, but speak the truth in love. Because people will know we care when we share that. And we can make decisions that are ethically and morally correct, that differ with everybody around us, but we do it because that's who we are. And not just something that we're opposed to, it's who we are. With that also, goodness. These kind of overlap in our mind, don't they? What would you think about if you said goodness? All right. You know, Webster does that, so you can do it. You define a word with the word. Don't you hate that when you get to a dictionary and you're trying to look up a word and they use the word to define it? But yeah, you're thinking good things. What's good? Ah. That's exactly right. Great point. Brother Don, if you didn't hear him, he said godlike. Because when Jesus was called good, you remember by the rich young ruler, he said, why do you call me good? There's one good, and that's God. And so if we have goodness, it has to be godlike, doesn't it? He has to be the standard. And so we started with that. Our relationship with God is love, joy, and peace. It's not superficial. You know, that's not hyped up. That's qualities that we already embody, and that allows us to be God-like. And if we're God-like, then how did God treat us? Well, he was long-suffering. He was patient. He's kind and gentle. He's good. Now, do you think a person who is long-suffering and gentle and good will make good moral decisions? You think they'll struggle with what's ethical and what's not? You see, those are things, if we start there, if that's who we are and that's what we embody, then we'll face a lot of things in life. And, you know, our society is always evolving and changing and deteriorating, and oftentimes we may feel like we're pretty close to Genesis chapter 6 when man's thoughts and imaginations are on evil continually. Well, if man can choose for their mind to be on evil continually, can a man choose to embody the fruit of the Spirit? Can he? Now let's make it personal. Will you? Will you choose that? If that's the case, then we know that our relationship not only with God will be right, but our relationship with our fellow man will be right. Goodness would not allow us to be guilty of immorality of any sort. If we're talking about morality, fornication is immorality. We'll not be guilty of that if we are people like God. Because you see, our relationship with God will be based upon fidelity, faithfulness. God started there, didn't He? In the Ten Commandments, they're not to have any other God before me. You're going to be faithful to Him, and if you're faithful to Him, then you have the embodiment of that goodness. Uncleanness. You see, those things are opposite of goodness and purity and God-likeness. And so it'll destroy that. If we're like God and we practice His purity and His goodness, then our relationship with man will be based upon pure motives. God's motives toward man have always been pure. He wanted what's best for man. He's willing to sacrifice that be available to man. And then that brings us to our regulation of our individual Christian life. And that starts with faith. Now, what's faith? Not a trick question, just what's your... All right, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 said it's the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. How would you simplify and define that as to how you embody it? Faith. Faith in whom? Faith in what? All right, it's belief. Trust in God. There it is. Brother Don said, goodness is God-likeness. Faith is trusting in God. You can't have the substance of those things hoped for unless you trust God who promised you you're going to have it. You have to trust that. Sometimes people, and they're making decisions, and they're complicated, and it affects their families, it affects their livelihood, and they began to hedge on ethical and moral decisions, and they began to make these kind of statements. Well, God would not want me to be unhappy. And if God expects me to do that, I can't serve that kind of God. Now think about that. If they're looking at what God said and said, I don't want to do that, I'm not going to do that, it complicates my life if I do that, I have to give up something if I do that, then obviously they don't embody trust in God. Would God require you to do something that would be harmful to you? Do you really believe that? You say, well, I wouldn't serve a God that required that. Why? Why would you not serve a God that required something of you? It had to be because you don't trust Him. There have been times when I don't fully understand everything, but I fully understand who God is. Now, I fully understand that God cannot lie, that He's made some promises to me, and in His closing book, He records for me through inspiration, blessed are those that do His commandments, for they shall have the right to the tree of life, and they shall enter in through the gates into the city. I trust that. I have faith in that. And now if I begin to make application then about what God requires of me and my relationship with you, and I'll say, well, but you don't understand. That person's personality is just strong, and you don't understand how hard that is. And then all of a sudden I don't trust God, and I take myself from the view of the cross when there were harsh, mean, vicious folks who were chastising God's Son. And that His Son was able to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what to do. So I can trust Him in whatever He asks me to do, and I know that He'll keep His promise to me. With that being said, that destroys idolatry. Can't have any other God before Him. If you did, what would that say? I'm not sure you can provide everything I want, so I'm going to have another God that provides other things that I want. We have to back up from there and say, it's not a matter of what I want, it's a matter of what I need, and my God has provided all I need. And I trust that. And He emphasized to them that they were not to make unto themselves any graven images, and so it destroys that if you trust God. And adultery. If you trust God, then you're going to follow God's will and God's purpose. And He even illustrated in the Old Testament and in the New that our spiritual relationship with God ought to be the template for our relationship in our marriages, and we shouldn't break those vows. We should be faithful to those vows. We trust God's plan to bring those things about. It would also destroy witchcraft, and that's, folks who think in some kind of magical way they can circumvent God's will and God's purpose. Can you think of someone in the Old Testament who didn't trust God, and because of God's punishment of him, he wasn't willing to accept God's pronouncement, and he chose witchcraft? King Saul. You see, when God told him to go destroy the Amalekites, he took upon this moral mantra that he thought, I know a little better than God does. It would probably be better if we just took the spoils from the Amalekites, and it'd probably be better if all these nations around me understood that I am the conquering king, and so I'll bring back, like they do, I'll bring back the king that's been defeated, and I'll humiliate him before all the other nations, and I'll really be a king like the nations around. There's no faith there. You see, that should have regulated Saul to say, it's God who gave me this position. It's God who gave me this commission to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. It's God who had promised before this time that the Amalekites would be destroyed. He didn't trust that. And when he asked God to give him guidance and asked God to forget that he's going to take the kingdom away from him, and God would not respond to him, then he went to the witch of Endor. What do you know about God's pronouncement about witches? What was not to have happen? That's right. Weren't supposed to be alive. And so here's a person who didn't embody trust in God on a lot of levels. He not only didn't have the witches destroyed, he knew where they were. And now he decides that he wants to talk to Samuel, even though God had already made his choice. And when he brings Samuel back from the dead, the witch didn't do it. In fact, the witch was scared out of her wits, wasn't she? But he didn't have faith in God. And so you might think that's kind of strange for that to be listed in Galatians chapter 5 as one of those things that he says will keep you out of the kingdom of heaven is witchcraft. But you see, when you try to circumvent God's will and you try to come up with some answers on your own, that is witchcraft. It's asking someone or something else to circumvent God's will. Can't have faith and do that, and you have to follow God's will in that process. Meekness, and Tish mentioned this a moment ago and defined it for us. Meekness is strength under control. In our world, we often look at meekness as kind of mousy, somebody that just kind of a doormat for everybody else. They're kind of a meek person, soft-spoken, polite, always conceding, and that's just the opposite. Here's somebody that has the strength, the ability, the knowledge to do whatever they want to do. And they bring that under control to do what they need to do. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. Okay? You see, that's exercising a strength, an opportunity that God's given you, and that's not being meek about it. Moses was described as the meekest man on earth, and he certainly wasn't mousy, was he? But meekness will destroy hate. You see, that strength under control will keep us from retaliating to people, from being spiteful to people, of wanting to bring about vengeance among people. We'll take our strength, even if we could get even. A great example of that is when Joseph had strength in his hand. After his brethren had sold him into slavery, he'd been separated from his father all those years. And now that famine hits and Joseph's been elevated to the second position in Egypt. He controls everything. Everything. He even has the Pharaoh's ring. He controls everything. And here's his brethren. Strength. Can he get even? Can he make them pay? Could he kill them? All the above. What does he do? He brings that strength under control, and he said, you meant it for evil. God meant it for good. God's used it for good. Now, this God likeness that Brother Don told us about, Joseph is like God. God could have destroyed everybody. He chose to be long-suffering and patient. And now in our relationship with each other, we bring that strength under control, and he is in the place of God. Joseph is. Joseph looked at it like God sending him on ahead. Was it a pleasant experience? No, it wasn't. Could it have embittered him and caused him to hate his brethren? Could have. And we may even get glimpses of that in the story where you just wonder, don't you? Where he kind of sends them back and he buries the treasures in their bags, and he locks up the younger son, and you begin to think, well, is he just trying to get even? But probably the full story is he's just trying to see if they made any changes, and maybe see how they would react to this young brother if he took him away from them. Would they have compassion on him? They didn't have compassion on Joseph. They were heartbroken that he was going to keep Benjamin. Please don't do that. And they even at the point to say, you take our life, don't take that young man. You don't do this to our father. Now he finds out his father's still alive, and he said, if that's true, then you bring him here and you'll get the boy back. It's that context that he used to see if they would mistreat Benjamin. They didn't just say, you can keep him. They said, you take our life in his stead. That allowed him then to bring that strength under control and to use it. You ever had an opportunity to get even? I went to preacher school with a man. He'd always say, what goes around comes around. You know? You ever had those moments like, okay, buddy, when this comes all the way back around, I'm not going to forget it. You have the power to. It comes back around, what are you going to do? Roles are reversed, what are you going to do? Meekness will say you bring that strength under control. We're about to run out of time, so temperance. What's the difference in temperance and meekness? If meekness is strength under control, what is temperance? Beg pardon? All right. This is a self-control where you keep your temper, you keep your disposition under control. Even if you're not embody all the qualities that we might see in meekness, that you bring your feelings under control. Temperance is self-control. Now, what would be some of the sins that were listed that would keep you out of heaven that would indicate that a person's not practicing self-control? Illicit sex, this fornication, unrestrained behavior, not in control. Not under God's confines, not under God's dictate, not under God's blessings. Out of control. Unrestrained. Lasciviousness. That is this unrestrained desire that one would have to gratify the flesh. Those are things that demonstrate to us a lack of control. Revelings. Keep you out of heaven. What do we normally think about when we think about reveling? Partying, where you just gratifying things of the flesh, and those usually are not looked at as any kind of discipline, are they? No temperance, no self-control. Sometimes even in some worship services today, kind of borders on reveling, doesn't it? Doesn't have much control. God's not going to tell people how they're going to worship, and people want to worship in a certain way. They get certain gratification. That regulation of the individual life doesn't demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit. What we'll try to do next week is take these things that we have rehearsed that are not accidentally placed to follow after the things that will keep us out of heaven, the sins, but are placed there so we can see how that is governed, how that is dispelled, how that's controlled, how that is destroyed. And it's by the fruit of the Spirit. And you can't say, well, that'd be a nice thing to have, but you really can't think that we would have all those things. Oh, yes, He would expect us to have all those qualities. And if we do, then we embody those things in a way that we can make really, really good decisions. We're going to talk about how that is all placed together and how we might use that, and how other, aside from Paul, how other apostles use that to illustrate how we ought to live. Because you see, that's really how you make moral and ethical decisions, is you are a moral and ethical